So we have the results of the French elections, but what's the impact on the bond market? Eric, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, the impact on the bond market is almost neutral because, as usual, you have to buy the rumor and sell the fact. So today the markets are relatively stable. The Bund is performing well. France is closed today, so it's a bit unusual, but we will see tomorrow in France. The spread with the French OAT is stable, and I think that nothing is changing. The most important impact is probably in the forex market, because the euro was above 110, and it is probably a very important parameter for the next coming weeks. Should the euro continue to strengthen against the dollar, it would have an impact on the bond market.
And what do you have to say on this, Annie?
Yeah, from a bond market perspective, we welcome this presidential election, and we are quite optimistic. Although, of course, Mr. Macron will have to deal with a lot of issues. We have, in 5 weeks' time, we have the legislative election, which is going to be very important. But we're quite optimistic because we think that the environment from a macroeconomic perspective is good to pass on reforms. So it's not a continuation of the previous presidency in France. Indeed, France is running, in terms of its GDP growth, it's running at almost 1.5% this year and next year. So from a macroeconomic perspective, it's a good momentum. Just before the first round of the election, we had reinforces some of our bond on the French names, where there has been quite of a lag vis-à-vis other European counterparts, and especially the US.
Now, what does this result mean for the ECB?
Yeah, the ECB, I mean, from the latest ECB meeting that took place in April, Mr. Draghi sounded quite optimistic on growth. However, he maintained his dovish stance on inflation, which is a bit surprising, but in a way it was ahead of the presidential election in France, and he kept a cautious stance. Inflation rates have been running a bit higher. Of course, headline inflation in Europe was at 1% in December. It's hovering around 2% now. Core inflation also is picking up. So we feel that probably at the June meeting, or sometimes between June and fall, the ECB will announce some tapering. But we are, in terms of rate hikes, we're very, very far away. If we look at market participants' expectation on the ECB rate hikes, we see only a 50% chance of a 25 basis point rate hike by mid-2018. So we're very comfortable with that, and that is why we have an overweight in terms of European counterparts vis-à-vis US, for a lot of different reasons. The ECB, the euro has been strengthening vis-à-vis the dollar. So from a European investor perspective, holding US credit is less of an advantage right now. And also because of the Fed surprise move we had in terms of the Fed hike in March, it looks more interesting for European investors to be invested in its own currency.
Now, Eric, what can you add to that?
Yeah, I agree globally with Annie. I slightly disagree on one point, that inflation, our inflation forecast is not really clear, because we had a very strong figure recently, but the first figure 1 month ago was disappointing. The core inflation was at 0.7. So today we still do not know if the sudden rise of inflation is only temporary, or if it's the beginning of higher inflation in Europe. So the ECB should be very cautious, because in addition you have less political uncertainties, but at the same time more economic uncertainties. I slightly also disagree with the consensus, because in my opinion political uncertainties obviously decreased, because now everybody knows that Mr. Mélenchon or Mrs. Le Pen will not be the next president in France. But as Annie mentioned, there is the assembly election next month. And if you imagine that the next parliament in France will be 1/3 Front National, 1/3 Socialist, and 1/3 Republican, it's impossible to run the country. And I have also a very strong conviction is that this election in France has 5 rounds. 2 rounds of presidential election, we know the result now. 2 rounds of assembly election, but the 5th round will be the most complicated, is the negotiation with the trade unions and the risk to see trade union, and in France in particular, the behavior of French trade unions is very special. We cannot exclude the risk of facing a major strike in France or a lot of turmoil once trade unions start to disagree, to strongly disagree with Mr. Macron, whatever the outcome of the assembly election.
Now, one final question. Has the power of populism passed in Europe?
We've seen the defeat of the Austrian, the populist at the Austrian election, Netherlands, and now France. Of course, Italy remains a problem. I think one of the key next problem will remain Italy, because it has a huge debt and it's also facing some political uncertainty. But other from that, we are quite positive on European bond market. And we think the US is very expensive. So in terms of relative value, we see more value in the European bond market.
Well, thank you both so much for coming in the studio today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you at home for watching. Don't forget to click back for more interviews like this.